In recent years, an important idea has been spreading around the world that businesses of many shapes and sizes can thrive and serve customers better as participants in ecosystems. More collaborative and varied, more adaptive and nimble than traditional industry structures and value chains. Ecosystem is a useful metaphor that points to a deep interdependence across players as they co-evolve and together create and share resources. Everyone contributes, benefits, and is invested in ensuring the sustained success of their collective common interests. Some ecosystems, like learning and wellness, are built around needs and issues, while others, like eBay and Apple, are built on top of powerful platforms that invite the active participation of a large number of other players. Businesses that understand ecosystems and how they work are discovering exhilarating new opportunities to co-create new value with multiple players, often including customers, using the coordinating power of advanced technologies, create, scale, and serve untapped markets faster than ever before. Work with others to meet vital human needs and desires in ways that would be beyond the capacities of any single organization. Attract and activate passionate communities of talented individuals and organizations. And accelerate learning and innovation. In a world of ecosystems, there are challenges for major incumbent players who need to adapt to thrive. But the opportunities for forward-thinking leaders and businesses are truly extraordinary.
Hi everyone, welcome to today's conversation sponsored by Deloitte on thriving in an ecosystem world. I'm Diane Brady, your moderator for today's event. We have four fabulous experts who will join us in talking about how you do thrive in today's environment. As a journalist, I've been fascinated by the rise of the sharing economy, the term ecosystem being used again and again to describe new models, new tools, new ways of working. But yet, most of us feel paralyzed. Please join us in today's conversation via Twitter. You can ask questions with the hashtag #BusinessEcosystems. We'll be channeling your questions later. I want to introduce our four guests today. Eamon Kelly, who is the Chief Marketing Officer of Deloitte Consulting Strategy and Operations Practice, and also the editor and co-author of the report that we'll be talking about. We have James F. Moore, who actually coined the term, I believe, and researched the term 22 years ago on business ecosystems, a business strategist, author, academic. Welcome, Jim. Anna Moyo, who is a leader in Deloitte's social impact practice and somebody who's really looked at how do you take these massive, multifaceted social issues and turn them into wicked opportunities, which I think is fascinating. And last but certainly not least, we have John Hagel, who I think of as a Silicon Valley icon, entrepreneur, thinker. You've done a number of startups, and also you're the co-chair of Deloitte's Center for the Edge. So welcome. Eamon, I'm going to start with you. Talk about why now? We've heard about this now for 22 years. What's the urgency, and how are we actually seeing this transformation take place?
Thanks, Diane. The urgency is that ecosystems today are doing nothing less than redefining the shape and structure of the economy. They're increasingly determining business success and business failure. They're enabling massive and rapid innovation around the world. And essentially, they're playing a very, very critical role in shaping the future of our society. So those are pretty audacious claims, but I believe this is a tremendously important concept for everybody to understand, because if you take this basic concept of what is an ecosystem, just to go back a little bit to the history, the phrase was first coined in 1935 for the natural environment by a British British botanist called Arthur Tansley. And he basically said the basic units of nature can be understood as ecosystems, physical spaces in which there are resources like oxygen and other gases, soil and minerals, water, and lots of species from trees, mammals, reptiles, insects, bacteria that are sharing resources, creating resources for one another, competing for resources, co-evolving and constantly adapting. And as I say, this was the basic units of nature. Now, 2 years later, in 1937, the US government came out with its first standard industrial classification system. After the Depression, trying to make sense and really understand the economy. They didn't use this term, but essentially what we were doing there was looking at the basic units of the economy. Now, about 6 decades later, the gentleman to my left, Jim Moore, brought these things together. And he said, look at what's happening in the world of business. It's looking more and more like these ecosystems that we understand in nature. And what Jim identified really, I think, was a critical moment in probably the longest standing trend in business, which has been a move, steady move for the last 100 years, away from highly self-contained organizations and corporations that kind of own all the assets that are required and all the capabilities for their value creation system, towards something that's much more interactive, distributed, relational-based. Jim picked up on this about 10 years into the world of supply chains and outsourcing and virtualization of organizations. Now, why now? Because since Jim did that work, extraordinary things have been happening that are really making this concept of ecosystems all the more critical. So it's 20 years ago since the internet met business. It's really only 10 years ago since most of us moved up, from clunky, slow dial-up modems into broadband access. It's only about 7 years ago that we started to have devices created for this internet world, our smartphones and our tablets. About 5 years since we had a cloud that enables us to access and store without having to own things. About 3 years since we had fantastic applications that start to change our lives. All of these are the kind of fundamental dynamics behind what's happening with ecosystems. Essentially, boundaries are blurring everywhere. The boundaries between what large firms and small firms can do. The boundaries between industries and sectors, the boundaries between organizations, the boundaries between technology domains, the boundaries between producers and consumers, where consumers used to be passive recipients, now they're active participants in the economy and in ecosystems. The boundaries between the digital world and the physical world, where we're seeing with 3D printing the ability to create physical products from digital files, with the Internet of Things, connecting smart devices, sensing, actuating, informing each other in the future with virtual reality. And then finally, this kind of very important boundary between what humans can do and what machines can do. Machine learning, cognitive computing, the rapid acceleration of development of narrow artificial intelligence. All of this is creating brand new capabilities. And so we're now living in a world where there's more nodes across more networks with more specialized capabilities, and above all, this extraordinary ability to connect them, to collaborate, to co-create across these systems. That's the fundamental shift that's restructuring the economy, and I think is actually going to fundamentally change our society in the future.
So what I think is interesting, as Eamon was saying, the world in 1993 was very different than the world in 2015. How are you thinking about this right now in terms of the transformation that you're seeing, Jim? And just give us some sense as to what you find exciting in terms of the possibilities, because we use the term now, but a lot of people don't really know how to navigate this world.
Thanks, Dan. I'm going to use notes because I want to get to some specifics that people can look up. And I've got a Twitter feed at James F. Moore 1, which I invite you to go to after this, and I'll put these references up. I think what's happened is the concept has become totally generalized. As the information technology platform has made it possible for people to link with less and less cost, with more and more effectiveness, people have begun to see that they can build ecosystems as small as my personal ecosystem. So one of the things I'll talk about is increasingly we want to be like Marvel superheroes, and we can do it with some apps. I mean, in rather remarkable ways. And we can build social movements around our superheroes and have, superhero teams. And by the same token, you look at something like the California water crisis that spans, agriculture and smart cities and, infrastructure. We're developing a unit of analysis to look at those as comprehensive, co-evolving systems. And it's not surprising that the business ecosystem concept or the ecosystem concept has become ubiquitous, because what it does is it reflects the maturing of systems thinking. It reflects the maturing of not only business people's thinking, but thinking in math and thinking in operations and so forth. So 20 years ago, the leading tech companies tended to think about ecosystems they could, which were building out of their products. And that would be the Intel. Today, as we look at any scale of ecosystem, we begin to ask the same questions, but we ask them anywhere we want to. So the questions are still about the same, and the three I like to start with are sort of the who's in the ecosystem, and by who's in the ecosystem, that also helps you define your nominal boundary, and then what are they trying to do together, and then how can we radically improve that? Mm-hmm. And with those three questions, people in business these days look all over and begin to see how they can improve the connectivity systems, the synergies, the mutualities among these things. And then once you have that, you can lead to a next level of ecosystem design where you begin to think about, well, what if I expanded the boundaries? What if I put more people in it? What if I brought science in a different way? You have
Sounds like chaos, letting everybody in.
It is like, well, it's not chaos in the sense that the ecosystem concept is a strategic concept. It's a mental construct applied to an area where you think you could improve something, whether your own fitness or California water. And once you apply that construct, then you begin to try to identify among the chaos, if you will, elements that if they were brought together around more shared purpose, more explicit shared purpose, around shared leadership, could be much more effective. So I think that's the...
Well, it's interesting because I think the shared purpose actually does pivot nicely into what you've been looking at, Anna, which is the idea of how you actually use ecosystems and how they look different when you apply them to these problems. California water crisis, malaria. Give us some sense of sort of what the world looks like now, because we've had, many players trying to tackle these problems for quite some time. What does an ecosystem look like in that environment?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And Jim, I love how you framed ecosystems as a construct. I think that's a really important thing to hold on to. And we've been talking a little bit about how businesses activate ecosystems in order to allow them to compete and collaborate in different ways to create new value. And I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about ecosystems that are designed and built for a different kind of purpose, and that is to tackle the tough social problems we face as a society, whether that's rising crime, joblessness, food, agriculture, water, huge one, education, health. We could spend the next 45 minutes chronicling the persistent ills we face as a society. Ecosystems in this context, they do a few things that are really important. One is that they really engage a diverse set of actors, kind of unusual suspects from each of the three sectors, the public, the private, and the social sector. And they find really powerful ways to mobilize them behind a shared understanding of a problem or an opportunity that they all have in common. And then work to strategically align these different intents and to coordinate action. And we're seeing unprecedented networks of NGOs, social entrepreneurs, international development organizations, governments, policymakers, researchers, academics, even business people who are coalescing around what we think of as wicked problems. And why this is so critical today is because of one very real and undeniable fact, that the problems we face are outpacing our ability to solve them. And wicked problems are wicked. They're hard to solve. They're wily, emergent, and shifting. They're cross-cutting. They defy sector boundaries or issue silos. And they certainly defy silver bullet solutions. So no one organization, no matter how powerful, global, brilliant, has the solution to a wicked problem. And even more important, these problems can no longer continue to be the sole purview of the social or the public sector alone. They really do require that businesses stand up and get involved. And Because fundamentally, you cannot have a healthy company thrive in an unhealthy community or an unhealthy city or an unhealthy country. And so we're seeing ecosystems sprout up all across the globe, many of them led by businesses that are focused on tackling a range of problems. For instance, there's an ecosystem that's focused on dramatically reducing carbon emissions across 8 states in the Midwest, with over 160 organizations participating. The Pope would be very, very happy about that. We have ecosystems that are focused on increasing access to fresh, safe water for millions of people across Africa. We have ecosystems that are focused on creating really viable markets for immunizations for poor countries around the world. And one of my favorites that I've been looking at is actually being led by Unilever to tackle a really bold and audacious goal of changing the hygiene behavior of over 2 billion people on this planet.
With hand washing and soap.
With washing your hands with soap. Why? Because that will dramatically reduce the 3 million people who die every year, most of them children under the age of 5, from diseases that result from poor sanitation and hygiene. So Peter Drucker framed it really, really well when he said a few years ago that, and I love this, he said, every single social or global issue of our day is a business opportunity in disguise. And the really good ecosystems, solution ecosystems, recognize that. And they work hard to flip wicked problems into wicked opportunities, and then figure out how they can drive real and sustainable, and that's a key word, change and impact through cross-sector action.
Which I think it's interesting that these things just don't happen organically. It's not by osmosis.
No.
If you build it, they will come. There has to be an actor. It is often business. I want to turn to you, John, to ask, you know, one of the big struggles people have is how do you create value, measure value in this environment? You're out there talking to leaders in different capacities. What's your advice? And even give us some sense as to what's intriguing around where is the value being created, and how do you strategically go about thinking differently about your business model in this environment?
No, it's a great question. I think one of the paradoxes is that precisely at the time as we were talking about that ecosystems become much more viable and feasible, and it's more in the conversation and in the business world, there's still a fair amount of ambivalence, I find, from senior executives around, okay, interesting, now what do I do? And I think part of it has to do with the notion of tying it back to very tangible short-term issues they're wrestling with. So one example is companies across the world are under increasing pressure to drive growth. You know, just getting bottom line profitability isn't enough. Investors are asking, where's the growth? And typically when you get into a conversation around growth with these executives, they tend to frame it as one of 2 options. You either make it internally or you go out and buy it through an M&A acquisition. But those are the 2 approaches to growth. It's only a question of how much of each do you want to do. If you add the ecosystem dimension to it, I think there's a third path to growth, what we call leveraged growth, which is how can you create growth by mobilizing complementary resources that add value to your marketplace or your customer, and create value for yourself in the process and drive growth in that way. That's a very powerful third path that today in most companies is not even on the agenda. We've looked at a whole series of companies. I think the companies that are most kind of sophisticated and advanced in terms of harnessing this third path are actually in China and India. And one example of a company is this Li & Fung that we've written a lot about, which is in the apparel industry. They work with apparel designers around the world and take care of everything from sourcing of raw materials through all the stages of production, logistics, getting it to whatever distribution center anywhere in the world. The interesting thing about them is they actually do none of that themselves. They operate through a global network of 15,000 business partners.
So they're the facilitators, they're almost the connective tissue and fabric around.
We call them orchestrators. They're orchestrating all these activities because they're very complicated, time sensitive, have to be done in certain points in the process. And so they're orchestrating this process. The point, back to leverage growth, is they've experienced double-digit growth revenue growth. They're now a $20 billion company, so not insignificant, $20 billion company. But the growth has all been through adding partners in their ecosystem versus adding a bunch of employees and doing it internally or going out and doing a bunch of acquisitions. Very interesting model. If you're under pressure for growth, this is a very interesting option to pursue.
Well, and I think it gets to the point around how you mobilize talent. So you had a point you wanted to
Well,
raise.
I think there's a parallel. I think that that's a great story, and I think there are parallels everywhere. And you know, my favorite is in the smartphone world, where you have ARM Holdings as the kind of technologically based Li and Feng that has put over 1,000 companies into the semiconductor business, helps orchestrate the relationships among them, helps set standards, puts out generation after generation of designs and physical intellectual property, organizes the fabs that make the chips, works with the vendors, and the result has been the growth of the mobile ecosystem to $2.2 trillion over the last few years. Enormous growth in smartphones and smart devices, and now in little Internet of Things and Fitbits and so forth. And in the same time that the PC industry, which depended on a very different model, not a model of adding partners, but a model of sort of building up a few core companies, has really been stagnant. It's had a very difficult time pulling in enough capital, a very difficult time pulling in enough talent, and very difficult time getting to work in other countries. This other model harnesses resources all over the world.
Well, go ahead, because I think one thing that's interesting to me is we do pay a lot of attention to platforms. They do, when you talk billions, they are getting a lot of the value. A lot of this stuff is expensive. Research is expensive, you know. So I think it's a question of all the players that are getting into the ecosystem. How do they create value as well? If you're not a Li and Feng, if you're not ARM Holdings, you were going to mention a point as well.
Well, I was just going to point out that the paradox to me is that at the very same time you have the examples of Li and Feng and the one Jim mentioned, you have most large companies today are shrinking the number of participants in their supply chain, shrinking the number of participants in their distribution channel because of mounting near-term pressure on the one hand. And on the other hand, I think also one of the big obstacles I see among traditional executives to this notion of ecosystems is the fear of loss of control. Mm-hmm. You know, I'm in a world of mounting pressure, I need to control everything. So I'm going to bring more and more in-house as opposed to let it go. And I think part of the message around ecosystems has to be, well, you're not going to have command and control in the way you're used to within the silo of your enterprise, but there are significant ways to shape and influence the behavior of an ecosystem that are very powerful if you understand the mechanism.
Well, and I want to turn to Eamon a second, because I feel like there is this issue where, you know, you may host the party, but then it's like, who invited you to come to this party? And we do worry about, you know, some of the outliers, some element of control. Give me some sense, Eamon, sort of as you're looking at the environment right now, what you think are some of the underappreciated strengths that people might bring to the table, and also some of the mistakes that you see companies making, brands making, or just various players making in terms of actually creating value.
Let me flip that just a little bit, because...
Go ahead, flip it.
Flip it, man.
Flip it into a wicked opportunity.
Not quite, but I'm headed in that direction. I think it'd be very easy. We're fans of the concept. We're seeing the good practices. We're seeing the potentiality. We're seeing real opportunities. I loved your example about the states collaborating around the carbon emissions, etc. And it's very easy for us to get a little frustrated when we look and say we're not going fast enough or there's too many impediments. But I actually think if we look at things like, if you look at the supply chain profession, which I think has, you know, transformed the world in many ways. They've been such a huge enabler of us getting to this point. The supply chain profession is very sophisticated about understanding basically what that did initially was it moved from an ownership model to essentially, John, a control model, right, or a management model. It's now moving towards a much more open model of understanding that, there's actually people in our supply system have data, they have relationships, they have access to customers that we actually don't have, and that we can learn from. And so this kind of redesign and increasingly sophisticated view of the supply chain as a learning resource, as a source of innovation, this is happening, and this is not just one or two. This is happening across a whole profession. Has been moving, I think, very ambitiously and very effectively in that general direction. So I think there's a lot of reasons, and I think also if you look at the world of portfolio management. We're now seeing quite a lot of moves where people are trying to figure out, what do I actually really need in my portfolio? And what can I have relationships with? And this whole question, I am hearing more and more people ask this question of themselves and coming up with pretty smart answers to it around, how can I activate other people's assets, other people's capabilities, other people's knowledge and insight? How can I systematically access that without having to own it? What's the nature of the relationship? So I think there is this shift from looking at all of this from a tremendously transactional perspective, and I agree with you, John, I think we still tend to that default too much. But I think there's been I'm certainly witnessing in my interactions with clients around the world, I certainly witness much more emphasis now than there used to be on what's the nature of the relationship, what's the co-creation, what are the opportunities here for really getting value from other people's assets.
So, Diane, can I pick up on some themes?
Yeah, then we're going to go to a Twitter question.
Oh, we are.
Go ahead, Anna, go.
That I'm hearing across the panel, and it's a few things. One, and John, you mentioned around this need for some entity to manage this complex orchestration, or at least to be the kind of air traffic cop or controller. And we see that in these ecosystems that we've studied, that this need for what we think of as an ecosystem integrator, you called it orchestrator, but it's the same idea of, these problems or opportunities require, and it's not that someone's directing the action of, the Coca-Cola company in Africa is leading a 6-year, $30 million effort to improve access to safe drinking water for millions of people. That requires a pretty intense cross-sector collaboration. And how we engage in that kind of ecosystem where we don't have the control, there's no mandate from the CEO, is really pushing us to think about new ways of engaging in new leadership capabilities that we need, and we can talk about that later. The other thing I heard is this idea of these ecosystems are really rich platforms for what we think of as a portfolio of interventions, right? They really do allow a range of interventions to be launched from them that work at different altitudes, that pull on different levers for change. And so, because some of the wicked problems we face, there is no one solution to them. And they really are innovation engines to allow these solutions to kind of upend the status quo. And we're seeing that across the board, which is very exciting.
So one of the questions that's come in, and I'm paraphrasing here, but it is around, we alluded to the boundaries between the human and whether it's augmented reality, artificial intelligence, essentially the robots, and how much that's actually disintermediating the human component in some of these ecosystems, bringing greater efficiency. How far do you think that is going to go in terms of whether it's the robots taking over the ecosystem? But give us some sense as to what you think the world looks like, in some of these areas, healthcare, different industries, and how that also changes the value proposition.
Well, thanks. That's a great question, and I think this whole issue of artificial intelligence, increasing automation, is a tremendously important one. I don't think it will ultimately take humans out of the equation,
no.
But it definitely has an impact. So look, the Industrial Revolution essentially automated routine manual work. Expert software started to automate routine cognitive work. Artificial intelligence is making inroads into non-routine cognitive work. It is a shift. And as that applies to robotics, that's going to come into the non-routine manual work. So really the non-routine area is now being impacted, and it's
and the Internet of Things, as all these devices come into the network.
Everything connecting. And one of the really important things about machines, and essentially what's happening in this area, is machine learning and increasingly smart algorithms and faster computational speed and the ability to do parallel computing and some breakthroughs in neural networking and all the rest of it, those things are creating learning capabilities in automated, computerized learning capabilities. The extraordinary thing about machines and robots is that once one learns it, every other one in its network instantly learns it too. That's the big difference between us as humans. You can learn lots of things. You know loads and loads of things. Just by hanging out with you, I don't learn them, right? But robots do, right? Computers do. So this is going to accelerate. I personally believe it's going to just simply massively expand the art of the possible. And let's take just one. You mentioned healthcare there, Diane. So I think this is a perfect illustration. The healthcare industry is now, in my opinion, the center of an ever-expanding wellness ecosystem. Mm-hmm. And this is really about, what do people really need and want? We don't really want to get fixed by doctors and drugs. We want to be well, right? We want to be well.
Right.
And there's now all kinds of additional ways in which wellness can be promoted. So we all know about the diagnostic devices and the quantified self. We're seeing increasing diagnostic capabilities that are going to get linked increasingly to our smartphones. We're seeing breakthroughs in things like IBM's Watson, which is one of the poster children, obviously, for artificial intelligence, doing diagnostics, prescribing patient care treatment plans. These are very sophisticated, technology-driven elements of the health ecosystem. We've got breakthroughs coming in affective computing, the ability to read micro-expressions in the face, or the ability to detect emotion from tone in the voice. Those are going to be increasingly clever at telling us when we're getting stressed. We know that stress is one of the kind of fundamental underliers of unwellness. The ability to understand our stress levels and get interventions in place in a timely manner. All of these, you have the food industry moving towards nutrition under the banner of wellness. So you've now got lots and lots of different parts of the economy congealing and coalescing around human wellness in brand new ways. And artificial intelligence is a tremendously important part of that. So is all the other connectivity around. We've now got experiments, at least, in open sourcing of drug development. Yeah. We have massive access to patient data that creates patient communities, where once that data is getting analysed, the insights and understanding of disease conditions and pathways exploding. So if you look at these technologies, you can say the human's not there. Well, the human's always going to be there in some capacity. We just have to figure out how do we work with the machines in the future. But what it's doing is it's really enabling us to much more immediately than the old industry structures get at our fundamental needs and wants, whether that be wellness, whether it be learning, whether it be mobility. These are all areas in which ecosystems are going to create a very, very different future.
So I want to ask a little bit, this has also come up on the Twitter feed, is some of the areas of friction that come up with this is on the policy front. We've talked, if you look at an Uber or an Airbnb, there have been, the issues have always been, in some cases, in healthcare being a big one. Do the policymakers really embrace and help create these ecosystems? And how do you protect things like privacy? And how do you actually make sure that tax bases stay healthy? I'm going to turn to you for this.
Yeah.
Give me some sense as to sort of, and I think it's also something with the wicked opportunities. Well, what's the right policy response, and where do they play in this?
I think part of the challenge is, and people have talked about this a lot, is that in general our policy process lags and has sort of lagging models of what's happening in an industry. And it's not simply that the policy people are not smart. Part of it is that competitively, the business people are very smart, and their plans are secret. So in most of the things I've been involved where I've learned the most about business ecosystems, including ARM, it's been being invited into the executive offices where no one gets to go, and under some sort of strictures of non-disclosure, or in the rare case, being able to say what I see. You begin to understand the vision people have of the future, and that vision can be 20 years out, and it is invisible to policymakers. So the businesses are always outstripping, whatever the policymakers are doing, and in doing that, their businesses always inevitably disrupt the tax structures that those governments have depended on. So that in the Ubers of the world and the Amazons of the world, there's a tax arbitrage for the customer. But even if tax arbitrage wasn't a part of their business model, it just turns out to be a very difficult question, because taxes are kind of, in general, added ad hoc to places where somebody's making some money and you feel like maybe you could get some to do some purpose. It's not reasoned in a profound systematic way. So the conclusion of this would be, and I really am very interested in this these days, is how do you build an awareness of business ecosystems at the scale and scope and speed that we need to do these policy things and to evolve policy with companies.
So I actually want to turn this, because I think that there are a lot of people that are in that, I love the blue sky, but I've got to worry about the next quarter. And one of the questions that came in from Twitter, I'm going to ask Anna and John to address this in different ways, starting with you, John, is, we understand the, advantages of leverage growth, that third path you mentioned. How do you get started? I'm a business leader, I'm watching this. Okay, what do I do next?
I think it's very much, we call it zoom in, zoom out approach to building ecosystems. It's the notion at one level, I need to force myself to think longer term about where could my business go given these ecosystems, have alignment around that opportunity space, and then zoom in to very short-term, 6-month kinds of initiatives. What are the 2 or 3 things, and we caution against doing too many things,
Not
2 or 3
22
things.
or 33 things.
2 or 3 things that I could actually do in the next 6 months that would have tangible impact in starting that path to growth. It may be just interacting with a few participants in an ecosystem, but start to build the skills and the capability and the track record necessary to accelerate the growth of the ecosystem over time.
I know we only have a few minutes left. I think one of the big questions people have is around talent. And Anna, I want to talk to you a little bit about this, because I know you've thought about this in terms of even how do you think about talent on a personal level, and also as a manager, it feels like a very different environment in which to be managing employees.
Yeah, and I think what we're seeing is what is allowing these ecosystems to launch and flourish is, in a way, the advances in what I think of as the human technologies of leadership. And we are seeing a different type of leader, a different set of capabilities emerge and become critical to launch and participate in these. And we're even starting to name them different things. Peter Senge calls them system leaders. Joseph Nye, as professor at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, calls them trisector athletes. What this means is individuals who are really skilled at or are fluent in the language, the norms, the attitudes, and the behaviors of the different sectors, the public, private, and social sector, because they've operated in them. And then they're really fluid and capable of navigating between those. And why is that important? Because what enables these ecosystems to thrive is when an entity, that ecosystem, can kind of stitch together competing and different, sometimes conflicting, motivations, intentions, aspirations, and create a broader narrative for change and mobilize a lot of people behind that. And so that's a different kind of skill. We were talking the other day, Eamon, a term that I like is called connectional intelligence.
So what's connectional intelligence, Eamon? Do I have it? Can I get it? What do I do? Help.
For viewers, there's a very interesting book I'm actually reading at the moment called How to Get Big Things Done, The Power of Connectional Intelligence, which really builds upon Howard Gardner's multiple intelligences and Dan Goleman's emotional intelligence. And it's really the intelligence to look at systems and to understand the power of connectivity and bringing together disparate capabilities and understanding how to create the language systems and the interfaces. It's a different kind of intelligence, a different kind of discipline.
How do I hire for that? Do I hire for that, or do I just partner for that? What would you do?
I think you can hire for it, but I don't think we've codified it yet. I think this is an emergent, genuinely I believe it is a new form of intelligence that's required by a very new form of the economy. I don't think we've codified it, but yes, watch this space.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to pitch in. I thought we've had a key theme around learning and talent development through ecosystems. I think there's culturally a big hurdle that has to be overcome, which is, for most companies, your brand and your reputation is based on what you know, and you can be relied on because you know everything that's required to do something in the business world. To harness this kind of learning and talent, you have to be willing to ask questions and say, I don't know. I need help. That's a really big cultural hurdle for most companies to go over.
One of the Twitter questions that came in was about brands and how do you pick your partners? Because there is a sense of just opening the gates and saying, hey, everybody, come on in. That hasn't necessarily proven to be a successful win-win strategy for a lot of brands. How would you actually be choosing who gets to come in to service that community that you've built your brand around? Any advice?
I think it's a key question. I think it gets to the whole issue of governance structure and ecosystems and platforms, and that whole set of decision rules about what are the qualifications to participate in this ecosystem becomes critical to maintaining the brand integrity and delivering the value potential of the ecosystem.
And I like the way you've responded there, John, in that I don't think it's about who you choose to let in. It's about the behaviours and the values and the capabilities that you crystallize and make very, very clear in the protocols for engagement. So this is, to your earlier point to Jim, sounds like chaos. Could sound like chaos, but actually it's very orderly, because in good ecosystems there are good values, there are good clear norms, there are very clear protocols, there are kind of terms of engagement. And so it's less, I think, about looking around and saying you're in, you're out. It's more about what we do with software developer kits, right? That this is how you do it. Now you use it and create whatever you want, but that's how you've got to do it, right? There's some real clear protocols. I think if you take that mentality, but I think there's also a mindset shift. And I've had the privilege of meeting wonderful leaders over the last 20 years or so. As I ask these people to tell me their life stories, there's always some point where they've had a huge epiphany when they've realized, I can get so much more done if I don't try and do it all myself. And that's at the personal level, right? The leadership journey always is one of these moments. At the organizational level, we're now in an era where exactly the same thing is becoming true.
That's great.
We can get so much more done as an organization if we stop assuming we've got to do it all by ourselves.
Well, we can get so much more done. And this comes in via Twitter, fascination around the lagging players, the policymakers. You mentioned them, Jim. And Anna, I think that we see this very much. Wicked opportunities don't happen unless you get everybody to the table involved. How do you actually create at scale the kind of enlightenment, education around the opportunities here at the policy level? Because that is often the precondition for making these ecosystems really work. Any thoughts around that? Because we've had public-private partnerships for years, and usually the private side needs to make money, the public's, they don't always work out.
I think I'll just take a quick pass at it and pass it to you, Jim. But I think the policy angle in any of the ecosystems we've seen or worked with is definitely a key lever to pull. So if you think of, like I was saying, these ecosystems that create these platforms for a portfolio of interventions, one of them is obviously like, how do we change practice on the ground, or how do we change culture? How do we change the conversation? Unilever is saying, how do we change behavior? And then there's a real question of how do you change policy? And you need to develop a robust strategy around what's that agenda going to be to pave the way for the innovations that you want to seed in the world. And we see that a lot with social entrepreneurs who really are birthing these innovations, but they are in a policy environment that's not amenable to them. And so it's a both and. You have to operate in lots of different ways and pull lots of different levers.
And Jim, do you want to add to this in terms of the advice on how you actually create, and then we will.
Well, I think there's the short term is we could have another conversation about opportunities that sort of middle managers have in all organizations to do small things that make big impact in opening up the world. For example, if you have a supply contract with one vendor right now, make that contract with that vendor in a way that that vendor can license that technology to your competitors. If you're willing to do that, okay, you'll start to build an ecosystem right there, okay? And that's how ARM began, by the way, is that Texas Instruments made a deal with ARM and to together build something for Nokia, but they made very clear they could do it with other people because they wanted to build an ecosystem. So there's a set of those kind of things. And then I think the larger question is, and I'm very interested in this as a sort of a somewhere between an academic and not, mostly not, but someone interested in academics, is that the particular forms of academic economics that are informing policy right now are not the effective ones.
How we measure value, you mean?
How you measure value, how you measure the gross national product, how you think about economic interventions. They're macro or they're micro, they're never meso. And yet in the economics profession, and in the economics profession writ large, there's powerful work being done in this area. I mean, just to name one, Martin Nowak has a group at Harvard called the Center for Evolutionary Dynamics that's building game theory models of cooperation and competition and evolution that are
I like that.
powerful.
The rise of the middle manager, the rise of the meso. I want to actually, we could continue this conversation. It's just obviously the starting gate for many conversations around this area, but I want to have each of you end off with some closing thoughts in terms of either what should be on our radar, how to think about this, next steps, 30 seconds or so. I'm going to go to you first, John. Give us some takeaway in terms of how to be thinking about this. What's around the corner? 2
key points. One, to me, and it's come up in the discussion, one is that in a world of mounting performance pressure, increasingly the winners are going to be those who are most effective at leverage and learning. And ecosystems are critical to both. So ecosystems are going to be more front and center. I think on the other side, it's the notion of, subtitle of my most recent book, small moves smartly made can set very big things in motion. And avoid the temptation to do a big bang approach here. Start small, demonstrate impact, and scale from there.
Excellent. Anna?
You know, launching or engaging in ecosystems requires a lot of different ways of doing things differently, acting, leading, engaging, participating. But I think it requires us to ask a fundamental and important question, which is how many of the old ways of doing business, you know, operating in isolation, ignoring entire classes and groups of people, shrugging off ruinous externalities of the market, are we willing to let go of? And if we're smart, the answer will be quite a lot. And I think ecosystems are promising new problem-solving technology that's really in the beta form, and how they evolve and grow over the next few years will be really great to watch.
Great. Jim?
I think that fundamentally the idea of work that's underneath the ecosystem approach is a problem-solving approach. You know, you identify a problem and you try to fix it. You try to do something better with it, and it can be at any scale. And that's very different, for example, than the routinize the process way of thinking about business that was so deep in the quality movement, and wasn't bad exactly, but was very limited and put people in a very limited position. I think this notion of we are problem solvers, we are all empowered problem solvers, we can then work with others to solve problems, that's our job today. So that's one. And then the other one is we can't ignore the climate issues. You know, we just really can't. I mean, in California, there is no business that doesn't need a scenario plan for how their business is going to change because of this water crisis. Because, I mean, unless it really is cyclical in the old way, which I don't think it is, everything is going to be impacted. And that's going to be writ large around the world. It already really is, but maybe not as immediately. So that's the other piece, is that all these things Anna's talking about, the externalities and not caring about these things, that's not going to be tolerable by customers or by governments or by society going forward. So that's an important shift.
Last word to Eamon.
I think there's no doubt the world of business just now is being disrupted. And I think that's very threatening, and naturally very threatening for a lot of incumbents in major businesses and leaders and executives. On the other hand, I do think ecosystems expand the art of the possible. And that's where the richest set of new opportunities are to be found, is through adopting this ecosystem approach and figuring out, look at all the capabilities, look at all the human energy that's around there, look at all the kind of access that you have to so many unbelievably powerful capabilities. That's kind of the antidote to the threat of disruption. And one of the things, this might sound a little soft and non-businessy, but if you look 100 years ago of what was happening in the emergence of the industrial economy, it was a little bit dehumanizing. You know, people were literally being kind of harnessed to machinery. This is rehumanizing. This is about relationships. This is about values. This is about shared purpose. This is about interaction. And we are social beings. We live in community. That's, you know, and work is becoming community. And so I think, you know, this ability to kind of both harness and liberate human energy through your ecosystems and in your business models, I think there's tremendous opportunity here, and that, you know, it's good. It is tremendous kind of potential upside.
Well, I think to end on a note of rehumanizing, re-energizing, I'd like to thank Eamon Kelly, Jim Moore, Anna Moyo, John Hagel, and thank you very much for tuning in for Deloitte's conversation on thriving in an ecosystem world. For more information, please do. I believe there's a link at the end of this. Read the report. I think there's a lot of fascinating information in there, and this is a conversation to be continued. I'm Diane Brady, and thanks very much for joining us.